So yeah, just to preface this is my master's thesis and also something I'm going to be presenting next month on a panel with Priscilla. So if I like wink at her, it's, you know, it's not creepy. We're planning something. So I'm going to start with a little story for you. So when Fong Gum Lian arrived at the port of San Francisco in February of 1890, she claimed to be a U.S. citizen who had left San Francisco for China at the age of 13, and now she was returning at 21 to reunite with her husband that she'd married last year on his visit to China. But when she arrived, her husband was not on the dock as she had planned, so instead she was flagged for investigation, and she was taken to the Chinese mission home, which is right there, while she awaited her investigation. So at the mission home, workers were the first to tell her that her husband probably was planning to sell her into prostitution and that her marriage was probably a sham. And then that's something that immigration officials agreed with when they questioned her 2 weeks later. During her investigation, she never admits to any sort of sexual indecency, but it's the discrepancies in her story that kind of piece together some deception that agents consider to be deportable. So the 1875 Page Law comes into play because it defines the illegality is about immoral purpose. So basically, not even that you are a prostitute or that you were a prostitute before, but that you are intending to become a prostitute. And so this becomes a really slippery definition that agents apply in really different ways over time. And it links various elements of a woman's past, so like her work history, her familial history, even the way that agents read her body. It all kind of connects to this sexual identity that agents are constructing and then also constraining. So unfortunately, I don't have any cool pictures of what an interrogation looked like in 1890 because basically the only photos I could find were of men being questioned, but this is something from a little bit later, but a lot of women, they might look really young. I think that's really representative of who would be questioned as a target. So historians of sexuality, they really anticipate reading against the grain. It becomes almost a trope for historians that sexuality is something that there's just traces in the archive and you have to really creatively reconstruct things that aren't recorded. But I was really surprised in my project to find that I actually think the documents are really explicitly sexualized, and it's this visible primacy of sexuality that really shapes the way that immigration policy gets implemented. So I draw on Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, where he argues that the secularized confession constructs sexuality as something that's secretive and innate, but capable of being made visible through coercion. So he takes sexuality to be socially constructed and historically variable. So in this moment, I see it as really part of a larger pattern of like empirical forms of categorization and discipline that are constructed upon a degenerate body. So the Page Law, it privileges Chinese women's sexuality as a pattern of moral being rather than simply moral behavior, and therefore something that's predictable, and that's why you can have immoral purpose rather than, you know, an immoral past. So it's the crime that could happen, like, and it would include prostitution in a brothel as well as concubinage and polygamy, which were both common and legal practices in China. But then it also includes things that were remembered through this confession. So the literal admission of guilt is not really what I'm talking about when I say confession. It's more so the agent's ability to fill absences or inconsistencies in these testimonies with accusations of immorality. And Fong's transcript speaks to this quality of kind of amorphous guilt because her 2 days of questioning end when she admits that she was coached on the steamer by a woman that she met there, who had told her to lie and say that she was from San Francisco, and that's how she could get in, because she would be a citizen. And so such coaching was always tied in agents' mind to a type of procuring, and that this woman was probably helping her in order to then sell her into prostitution. And there's no evidence that this woman was actually that person, and she denies knowing anybody else that might have been tied to this network. But when we think about it logically, it's not surprising that somebody would have to memorize things, because you're being questioned for maybe 10 or 20 pages of script about where you were born and what day you left on the ship and what the weather was like when you left, and does it snow in San Francisco, and all of these questions that for somebody who, it's being translated from their native language even, we might think of memorization as something like pretty logical, but to agents it's a sign that this person is lying, that their true self is something that needs to be covered up. And so her immorality gets constructed as sexual intent, and she's deported. So many women in these interrogations were not actually deported, which is really interesting, because when you read history of the Page Law, it usually makes it seem like Chinese women just couldn't come to the US anymore, and it's really not that concrete of a barrier. And they really didn't work, because prostitution continued. They didn't really sort women into respectable and not respectable as they attempted to. But they do force all women to kind of stand trial as sexual subjects, which is what I have up there, and as like a minimum requirement for residency. And this is really new and unprecedented in the US. So I argue that nascent immigration bureaucracy in the late 19th century was founded on its construction and extraction of a condemnable, confessable sexual identity that rendered sexual morality as the base criterion for Chinese immigrant women's admissibility. Despite women's contestations and the ineffectiveness of confession-based interrogations in really preventing any prostitution, sexual policing remained entrenched in immigration law from 1875 on, and it continues to influence regulation today. So this study focuses on the period of 1875 to 1904 as the first formative period of this sexual policing. So I made a little timeline, in case you're wondering. I'm going to talk about a bunch of laws, but I'm going to do it really quickly. So I started in 1875 with the start of the Page Law, and I end in 1904 because in 1903, habeas corpus is suspended for Chinese subjects. So previously that had been their most successful way of protesting these interrogations, because it's the illegal seizure of their bodies, and they could say that they were being held against their will and without just cause. But that gets suspended in 1903. And then in 1904, Chinese Exclusion Law gets made permanent. So immigration for Chinese subjects really changes after that point. But then also in 1903, you have the Immigration Act of 1903 makes prostitution a deportable offense for the 3-year period after someone has entered the country. So now it's not even just about entry, but it's your state of being after you're in the US that you also have to behave. I'm glad that you're shocked by this. You're like the only one that hasn't heard anything about this yet. So then in 1910, that period of time becomes indefinite. So any time that you're caught prostituting, which of course there's a lot of ways that gets defined in 1910, it's a deportable offense. And people don't have a lot of legal recourse. So those are my dates. But I really think that as interesting as all of these developing laws are, and they're going to make a great dissertation someday, for today I'm really interested in this first period where the Page Law gets negotiated, and then you see how even though it's not really working, and even though it is so legally flexible, it becomes kind of the standard for imagining kind of the prostitute's place in society. So I'm going to trace this back a little bit to give you some history. I thought there might be some non-historians in the room, but no, that's not really true. So the mechanisms of sexual policing, I think they derive in a large part from late Victorian anxieties about individual degeneracy and then how it threatens the nation at large. So if you think about what's happening in the late 19th century, you have a lot of expansions of citizenship, of territory, economic purview, kind of in a global sense. But they're also prefaced by what Foucault calls like the biopolitical liberal state. And it focuses on managing life. So certain subjects are worthy of life. And it also requires the constant regulation of sexuality and sexual reproduction. So there's an attempt to kind of contain the heterogeneity that's coming with rising immigration and the shifting civic landscape after Reconstruction. And this is kind of, sexual policing is a way to reel it back in for a state that previously didn't seem to have a lot of like far-reaching power. So yeah, border expansion develops in tandem with border enforcement and the management of non-white populations within a system of white supremacy that I'm reading as being really imperial as well as statist, which is something that will get expanded hopefully in my larger project. So the regulation of immigrants offered up a fiction of security through exclusive nationalism. And Erica Lee writes about this as like the gatekeeping nation. So the US border as being a gate where you get to select who comes in and who's not allowed in. And so it approaches sexual policing as wedded to these aspirations for expansion and then the anxieties about exposure to non-white groups. And it accelerates across the progressive and Victorian and progressive eras. So a lot of historians write about kind of the break between these periods and kind of the ways that Victorianism maybe doesn't fit in the US. But in terms of sexual morality, I actually see them as really continuous in a lot of ways. And so what changes is that with like the rising state in the progressive era, it mobilizes Victorian codes rather than abandoning them. So what we think of as so iconic in the progressive era about reformist movements and about new state infrastructure, it's all very reminiscent of certain Victorian tropes. And so now I get a new slide. Okay. So the bureaucratic system that is constructed to carry out the goals of regulation, they operate most successfully because they're so monotonous. And so something that happens at 1890 is where I see the records shift really rapidly from being these very small cases to being just a huge paper trail. So I can illustrate that for you. So this is 1885, my experience in the archive. This is a pretty standard file. And I should say that my files only started in 1884. I think before that they weren't necessarily standardized in the same way, so they're not held in the same place in the National Archive. But in the period, I looked at maybe about 600 or 700 records. And this is really standard for 1885. You see there's like 2 written pages, and then there's a letter of recommendation from this woman's husband's employer. I'm kind of vouching that, you know, he's a good guy, and so she's respectable as well. And then the photo is really standard for women. But then 1890, the average file looks like that. So, and this is, what's amazing about this one too, is it's not even a lot of outside paperwork. This is, sometimes they would interrogate you and your husband and your uncle and, you know, your neighbor from when you were growing up. Sometimes they would interview like the midwife that gave birth to you. Like it's very strange who they would start to include in this circle. But even this file, like those 10 typed pages are all interrogation with the woman herself. And so that's puts a lot more pressure on a woman to perform in a certain way in order to be admitted. And it also switches from earlier, you'd see more of like a summarized paragraph of maybe what might be a longer conversation with the translator, but here it's actually written in question and answer format, and so that's where you get a lot more of these interrogation tactics coming through. So yeah, that's my favorite thing to show you on a slide. I think this repetition, in part, we can think of it as a convenience. Of course, there's other things going on in the background, so there's motivations for expediency. There's a lot of contention between immigration officials and then like local courts and judges who are actually a lot more, they're interested in enforcing the laws more accurately, and so they're more lenient with admitting people. So there's a lot of tension going on there. And then there's bribery and corruption and all those things that we know is going on in the background. But I also read this repetition as being part of kind of a proto-scientific disciplinary tool that really reinforces dichotomous race and gender categories. So you see the good woman and the bad woman, you see the Chinese woman and the white woman. They're trying to make those lines very stark. So this attempt at standardizing women's sexuality, I read it as a sort of fetishization through documentation. And I take that in large part from Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather, where she talks about the fetish, moving beyond the fetish as like a phallic substitution and thinking about it more as the way that something gets objectified for its like contradictions. So when looking at Chinese women as subjects, and in many ways they kind of butt up against like US agents' ways of knowing, I hate explaining this. All of you are in the class where we read this, so I'm laughing. But these contradictions, they come to embody this one subject, and puts a lot of pressure on this one subject to represent something or perform in a certain way that's really, really constraining to them. So what I think is exciting about this is that it puts into perspective like the volume of the documents as well as their content, which is something that historians are sometimes not great about dealing with, but really thinking about how sexuality comes through in this type of documentation and how much documentation there is, and that can also have sexual significance. So we're going to return back to Fong's case. You see these repetitious categories in the way that Fong gets questioned. It's always kind of jumping back and forth between asking her about her experience and then Chinese women at large. So to summarize a couple like examples of this, she is married, but she doesn't have a child, and the Asian is asking why she doesn't have a child. Does she know how babies are made? Has she slept with her husband? And these are like really sexual questions that 5 years before were not happening. But her response is, sometimes babies just don't happen. And then he says, how come so many young Chinese girls don't have babies? And it's surprising because we might expect the logic of kind of immigration regulation is that you want the people that don't have children, that the non-white children are like also going to be taking space in the country, and that would be a threat. But it's kind of this catch-22 where all of a sudden her not having a child is proof that maybe that her marriage is fake, and that he's actually just trying to sell her into prostitution, and that maybe she knows how to prevent pregnancy, which would have also been something that Chinese women in particular were kind of accused of as part of their hypersexualization, was that they knew how to induce abortion, which if you look at Chinese historiography, like there's maybe some truth to that, but it becomes a negative thing to state agents. And then, so I'm going to show you a little part of the interrogation if you want to read kind of how the record goes. But just to summarize, basically what she's getting asked is if she would do anything that her husband asked her to, which of course we might think that as being kind of a positive question. Oh, you have marital obedience. Oh, this is proper Victorian womanhood. But then it gets twisted into, oh, so you would become a prostitute if your husband told you to, and you don't have any agency against your husband. And so we see how marital obedience becomes moral weakness, and it devalues marriage as the marker of domesticity for Chinese immigrants. So it ties to this shift towards certain prostitutes being considered sexual slaves rather than free agent prostitutes. And it's particularly tied to a racialization of Chinese men as well, that they are somehow degenerate sexual partners, and that they're more likely to be procurers and pimps and kind of keep women subjugated. And some people even interpret that the Page Law, because there was one segment about prostitution and then the rest of it was about contract labor, there's a suggestion that maybe it's really about prostitution as contract labor, because there were sometimes contracts that these women would sign, and prostitution would be a way that they would pay for their passage. But to me, I'm not totally convinced by that argument, because it's clear that they're much more worried about like women's moral behavior than they are about like women as free agent laborers. And you see in other parts of the questioning that they really don't believe that women should be working or can be working and don't have labor rights. So I don't think that the fear is really about the contract labor as much as it's about, you know, the threat of prostitution to certain like heteronormative marriage. So we see then, just to give you a little taste of what's coming in the next 5 years of my research, this really comes into play on a national scale when you get like the white slavery panic that comes in, and I think a lot of it traces back to this construction of the prostitute that's kind of complicit in her victimization, but at the end of the day, she doesn't necessarily have power over what's happening to her, and that she's a victim of these procurers rather than being the victim of like an economic system that necessitates her work. Last page. Okay, so my project concludes in 1904, not because they realized that confessions were not working and they stopped coercing them, but because they really just spread this law much wider. So earlier I explained the 1903 and 1907 Immigration Acts as they relate to this project, but Chinese women themselves also continue to face exclusion in a lot of the same and different ways. So for example, these are pictures from Angel Island, which might sound familiar to you all as like the West Coast Ellis Island. It didn't open until 1910, but by the time it did open, detention becomes like a much bigger threat to these women, because it's not even that they're going to the mission home while they're waiting, but they're like being held on this island for sometimes for 2 weeks and sometimes for months and years. So let's see. I also see in the records that they start to kind of bundle women together. It's really interesting because after 1903, you see court cases ending up in the immigration files, which shouldn't happen, and you also see multiple women in one file because their situations are so lumped together. They'll say, oh, you were all on the same ship, therefore, like, you all must be, you know, working for the same person. You see people's spouses getting deported as co-conspirators and things like that. So it's becoming even more erratic for women, and also Japanese women are more and more included in some of these laws. So I look at these women, it's really hard because as much as I want to, you know, recover their voice and think about their agency and think about their resistance, and I think there are definitely ways to demonstrate that, they also just come up in the record as being perpetually detained. So they arrive, and before Angel Island, the place where they were questioned for at least some of the years was called the detention shed. It shows up on the record as, oh, the detention shed. Of course, that's where we would go. And then they might end up in a brothel where local policing makes it really hard for them to leave, even if, you know, if they are free agents, it's really not safe for them to be on the street. They might end up in the rescue home where they're called inmates and they're not allowed to leave until they're married or have some sort of respectable employment. And they also have to be married to a Christian Chinese man. And so that's also hard to do in San Francisco. And they usually get sent to like Montana. And then, or they end up in a courtroom and their testimony, they can't afford to hire their own lawyer, and then maybe they get deported, but it gets listed as voluntary deportation. And these women get encouraged to, return to where they came from. So discipline and confession, they really go hand in hand to shape the way that these narratives get recorded. Even though we know that the women were resisting the state's construction of them as powerless, degenerate, and disposable. So what remains in archives today, it eclipses a possible recovery of these women's actual sexual identities that we might think about. We don't really know, who they actually had sex with or how they had sex. All these things that would be really interesting to know, particularly for prostitution. It's not in the record where I'm looking, and so instead I'm having to really retrain myself to think that what's important to understand is how immigration regulation deploys exclusionary power and normalizes the sexual confession that sets a precedent for the 20th century. And with that, I'm all done.